The silence on the Galactic Council flagship turned deafening as Ambassador Vextar's voice echoed through the chamber. His words hung in the recycled air, sharp and cutting. "I refuse to sit beside this human," he hissed, six-fingered hands gesturing dismissively at Lieutenant Aisha Chen. "Their kind still wage wars over skin pigmentation. Too primitive for civilized company." Aisha's heart hammered in her chest. Every alien eye in the room, compound, singular, and otherwise, fixed on her. Earth's future in the Galactic Alliance hung by a thread, and here she stood, humanity's sole representative, being publicly humiliated. The Xorlian diplomat moved 3 seats away, his iridescent scales reflecting the starlight. "Perhaps when humans evolve beyond their barbaric instincts, we can reconsider their status," he added with a cruel smile. Aisha straightened her uniform, swallowing her pride. "I understand your concerns, Ambassador," she said calmly. "But perhaps working together might change your perspective." The grand meeting hall of the Galactic Council ship Harmony had never felt so vast to Aisha. Curved walls of polished metal rose around the circular table where 27 species had gathered to discuss the future of this sector of the galaxy. Light from the nearby binary stars streamed through the transparent ceiling dome, casting dual shadows beneath each delegate. Ambassador Vextar's scales shifted from deep blue to an angry purple as he settled into his new seat. The empty chairs between them seemed to stretch for miles. Several delegates murmured among themselves, their translator devices buzzing with activity as they discussed this unexpected display. "Order, please," called Elder Zimtal, the ancient Fordian who led the council. His gray, paper-thin skin wrinkled further as he frowned. This meeting was called to address the Krath border incursions, not to debate seating arrangements. Aisha nodded gratefully at the elder, but the damage was done. She could feel the weight of judgment from the assembled representatives. 3 months of careful diplomacy threatened by one prejudiced alien's public rejection. She straightened her back and opened her data tablet, trying to focus on the meeting agenda. The screen displayed detailed reports of Krath raider attacks on outer colony worlds. Peaceful settlements raided, resources stolen, civilians taken. Earth had faced similar threats centuries ago. Pirates and raiders were nothing new to human history. "Perhaps," came a melodic voice from across the table, "the human perspective might be valuable in this matter." The speaker was Kalora, representative of the Ithian collective, her translucent body glowing softly with bioluminescence. Their species survived numerous conflicts before achieving spaceflight. They understand violence in ways we have forgotten. Vextar scoffed. "That is precisely my point. We should not take counsel from barbarians on how to be civilized." And yet, Aisha spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Earth has not had a global conflict in over a century. We learned from our mistakes, Ambassador. Sometimes understanding darkness helps you better appreciate the light." Several delegates nodded thoughtfully. Aisha felt a small surge of hope. Fascinating philosophy from a world that still uses combustion engines, Vextar sneered. His aide beside him snickered, mandibles clicking in amusement. Elder Zimtal raised a gnarled hand. "Enough, Ambassador." The human world was invited to join this council because they showed remarkable adaptability and diplomatic potential. Lieutenant Chen deserves the same respect as any delegate. Aisha nodded gratefully, though she knew the elder's words were more about maintaining order than defending her. Earth needed this alliance desperately. Humanity had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, making them technological infants compared to most council species. Without the protection and trade this alliance offered, Earth would be vulnerable to threats like the Krath raiders. The meeting progressed, with delegates discussing defensive strategies and resource allocation. Aisha listened carefully, offering occasional insights when appropriate. Each time she spoke, Vextar's scales would pulse with irritation, but he refrained from further outbursts. During a short recess, Aisha stood by the observation window, watching the stars. The ship orbited a neutral space station, where the upcoming peace summit would be held. Representatives from 30 systems would attend, including several non-council species. Earth's inclusion was unprecedented for such a young spacefaring civilization. "He fears what he does not understand," said a voice behind her. Kilora floated closer, her form shifting like water in zero gravity. Sorlians place great value on evolutionary advancement. They see humanity's rapid technological progress as unnatural. Aisha smiled slightly. "We had to adapt quickly. Our planet was dying." "Necessity breeds innovation," Kilora agreed. "And innovation frightens those who believe evolution should follow a predetermined path." "Will his attitude affect Earth's standing at the summit?" Aisha asked quietly. Kilora's form pulsed with gentle light. "Perhaps, but remember, Lieutenant, respect is earned through actions, not words. You will have opportunities to show your worth." As delegates returned to their seats, Aisha noticed the empty chair beside Vextar remained conspicuously vacant, a small pointed reminder of humanity's precarious position. But as the stars continued their silent journey overhead, Aisha felt a strange certainty growing within her. Somehow, this empty seat would not remain a symbol of division forever. Little did she know how soon that opportunity would come. The emergency sirens blared without warning, bathing the council chamber in pulsing red light. "We're under attack," the ship's AI announced, its calm voice at odds with the message. Hostile boarding parties detected in diplomatic sectors. Panic erupted among the delegates. Most alien species had evolved beyond physical confrontation centuries ago. They had no concept of how to respond to violence. The chamber doors exploded inward. Masked raiders stormed through the smoke, energy weapons blazing. Ambassador Vextar, trying to flee, caught a blast directly to his chest. He collapsed beside the very seat he had refused to share with Aisha. Green blood pooled beneath his trembling form as raiders advanced. The other diplomats cowered or ran. Only Aisha moved toward the falling Sorlian. The meeting had been going smoothly for nearly 2 hours. Aisha had contributed several points about Earth's defensive strategies against piracy in their early space exploration days. Some delegates had nodded with interest. Even Elder Zimtal had commended her practical insights. Only Ambassador Vextar remained coldly dismissive, his scales shifting to an unimpressed gray whenever she spoke. Then, without warning, the attack came. The first blast shook the entire chamber. Ceiling panels crashed down as the ship's gravity fluctuated. The elegant holographic displays showing trade routes and defense grids sparked and died. "Emergency protocols activated," announced the ship's eye. "All delegates proceed to evacuation points Alpha through Delta." But there was nowhere to run. Before anyone could reach the emergency exits, the main doors to the council chamber burst open with a deafening explosion. Through the billowing smoke came 5 figures, taller than humans, and dressed in full tactical gear. Their faces were hidden behind breathing apparatuses and targeting visors. Each carried an energy rifle emitting an ominous blue glow. "Nobody move," shouted the leader, his voice distorted through his mask. "The Krath Collective claims this vessel and all its occupants." Kilora's bioluminescent form pulsed rapidly in distress. Elder Zimtal tried to stand, but his ancient legs gave way beneath him. The Jurgen representative transformed into his defensive shell state, becoming an immobile sphere on the floor. Others simply froze, evolutionary instincts failing them in the face of unexpected violence. Ambassador Vextar, however, made a desperate dash toward a side exit. "Stop," ordered one of the raiders, swinging his weapon toward the fleeing Sorlian. The weapon discharged with a high-pitched whine. The energy blast caught Vextar squarely in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward. He landed with a sickening thud next to the chair he had earlier refused to share with Aisha, his body convulsing as green blood began to seep through his ornate diplomatic robes. "Examples must be made," the lead raider announced coldly, stepping further into the room. "Your council has ignored our demands for recognition too long. Today, you will listen." Aisha's military training kicked in, overriding her fear. While the other delegates remained frozen or sought hiding places beneath the council table, she assessed the situation rapidly. 5 armed raiders, 1 wounded alien bleeding out, no visible ship security. The raiders were focused on corralling the delegates toward the center of the room, not watching for counterattacks. Without hesitation, Aisha dropped to the floor and crawled toward Vextar. The Xorlian's breathing came in ragged gasps, his scales fading from their normal vibrant blue to a dull gray. His eyes, normally sharp with disdain, now clouded with pain, widened in surprise as he recognized her. "Why?" he managed to whisper as she reached him. Aisha didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her hands against the wound in his chest, trying to stem the flow of blood. The consistency was different from human blood. Thicker, almost gel-like. It pulsed between her fingers with each of Vextar's labored heartbeats. "Don't speak," she whispered, tearing a strip of fabric from her uniform sleeve to create a makeshift pressure bandage. "Save your strength." One of the raiders noticed her movement and strode toward them, weapon raised. "Get away from him," he ordered. All delegates in the center of the room. Now, Aisha looked up, her hand still pressed firmly against Vextar's wound. "He'll die without medical attention." "That's not my problem," the raider said, the barrel of his weapon now inches from Aisha's face. "The Xorlians have opposed the craft for generations. One less won't be missed." Behind her mask of calm, Aisha's mind raced. The raiders clearly knew who they were attacking. This was no random piracy. They had specific knowledge of the council and its members. That made them more dangerous, but also more predictable. "If you let diplomatic delegates die, you'll never get the recognition you want," Aisha said evenly, not moving her hands from Vextar's wound. "You'll be labeled terrorists, not freedom fighters." The raider hesitated. Aisha could see his eyes narrow behind his visor as he processed her words. In that moment of indecision, Vextar's hand weakly grasped Aisha's wrist. His eyes, clearing briefly, looked directly into hers with something new. Not contempt, but confusion and the faintest glimmer of respect. "Why help one who rejected you?" he whispered, green blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Aisha pressed more firmly on his wound, feeling his pulse weakening beneath her fingers. "Because that's what humans do," she answered simply. "We don't abandon others in need, even those who don't like us." The raider's weapon hummed as he adjusted its power setting. "Touching," he sneered, "but ultimately useless. Move away now, or join him." Aisha looked up at the masked figure, then back at the wounded ambassador. Around them, the other delegates watched in terrified silence, their advanced civilizations suddenly helpless in the face of primal violence. In that moment, Aisha made her choice. "Don't move," Aisha whispered, pressing her uniform jacket against Vextar's wound. The Xorlian's eyes widened in confusion. "Why help, after my words?" He struggled to speak. Aisha's hands worked quickly, applying pressure. "Because that's what humans do." The raiders approached, weapons aimed. Using the conference table as cover, Aisha dragged the ambassador behind it. She grabbed a ceremonial staff from the wall and faced the intruders. "The hostages are valueless if dead," she called out, voice steady despite her fear. "I suggest you reconsider." The lead raider laughed. "One human against 5 Krath warriors. Your species truly is primitive." Aisha smiled grimly. "Primitive doesn't mean weak." Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage as Aisha pressed harder. The Xorlian ambassador's scales were turning a sickly pale green, not a good sign. She had attended exactly one xenobiology briefing on Xorlian physiology before this mission, but remembered they had 3 hearts. The energy blast had likely damaged at least one. "Stay with me, Ambassador," she whispered, checking his pulse at the throat ridge where she knew a major artery ran. It fluttered weakly beneath her fingers. Vextar's eyes focused on her face, confusion written across his alien features. "You risk your life for one who insulted your species." "Arguments and insults don't matter when lives are at stake," Aisha replied, tearing another strip from her uniform to reinforce the soaking bandage. That's something my primitive species figured out a long time ago. Around them, chaos continued to unfold. Most of the council delegates had been herded into the center of the room by 3 of the raiders. Elder Zimtal was attempting to reason with them, his ancient voice trembling but dignified. The remaining 2 raiders were approaching Aisha's position, having spotted her movement. "Final warning, human," called the leader, his weapon pointed directly at her. "Step away from the Exorlian and join the others." Aisha surveyed her surroundings quickly. The overturned conference table provided minimal cover. Behind her was a display wall containing ceremonial items from various council worlds, including a long, staff-like object she recognized as a Tauran honor blade. Not a gun, but better than nothing. In one fluid motion, she reached back and grabbed the staff while keeping pressure on Vextar's wound with her other hand. "Ambassador," she whispered, "I need to move you. This will hurt." Without waiting for a response, she seized him under the arms and dragged him fully behind the table as energy blasts scorched the floor where they had been seconds before. Vextar hissed in pain but remained conscious, his clawed hand clutching weakly at his chest. Aisha positioned herself between the wounded ambassador and the approaching raiders, the ceremonial staff held before her. "Stop there," she commanded, her voice carrying across the chamber with unexpected authority. "The Galactic Council has strict protocols for hostage negotiation. Dead delegates have no value." The chamber fell silent for a moment. Even the frightened delegates in the center of the room turned to look. The lead raider tilted his masked head, studying her with newfound interest. Brave words from a cornered animal. "Perhaps your species isn't completely worthless after all." He gestured to his companion. "Take her alive. Kill the Torlian." The second raider advanced, weapon raised. Aisha's grip tightened on the staff. "I don't think you understand the situation," she said calmly. "Earth may be new to your galactic politics, but we're very, very old hands at warfare." Without warning, she lunged forward, the staff whirling in her hands with practiced precision. Her first strike knocked the raider's weapon upward, sending his shot into the ceiling. The second strike caught him hard across his masked face, sending him staggering backward. The lead raider fired, but Aisha had already ducked back behind the table, the energy blast missing her by inches. "Primitive indeed," she muttered, checking quickly on Vextar. The ambassador's eyes were wide with astonishment. "You have combat training," he gasped. "All Earth diplomats in deep space have basic tactical preparation," she explained, peering around the edge of the table. "Never know when negotiations might break down." The stunned raider was recovering, reaching for his dropped weapon. Aisha knew she had seconds at most. "Ambassador, I need your help," she said urgently. "Is there an emergency response system in this chamber? Something I can activate?" Vextar's eyes flickered to a panel on the wall near them. "Council emergency. Protocol." Beneath the unification symbol, Aisha spotted the panel, a stylized image of diverse alien hands joining together. How appropriate. "Cover your eyes," she warned, then hurled the staff with all her strength at the panel. It struck dead center with a satisfying crack. Immediately, brilliant white light flooded the chamber as emergency beacons activated, temporarily blinding anyone without protective eyewear, which included the raiders, whose targeting visors amplified rather than filtered the sudden brightness. Shouts of pain and confusion erupted from the raiders as they clutched at their masks. Aisha seized her opportunity, diving forward to retrieve the fallen raider's weapon. "Everyone down," she shouted to the delegates as she rolled back to Vextar's side, now armed with the energy rifle. The lead raider, partially blinded but still dangerous, fired wildly in her direction. Aisha aimed carefully and returned fire, striking him in the shoulder. He stumbled back with a howl of pain. "Ship security will be here soon," she told Vextar, positioning herself to shield him. "We just need to hold out a little longer." The wounded ambassador looked up at her, his expression transformed from earlier disdain to something approaching wonder. "You fight. Like a Xorlian warrior of old, he said softly, before we became too civilized to remember the value of courage. Aisha gave him a quick smile. Sometimes being a little primitive has its advantages. The raiders were regrouping, their leader barking orders through his damaged mask. 3 were now advancing on Aisha's position, while 2 maintained control of the other hostages. "Last chance, human," called the leader, his voice tight with pain and rage. "Surrender now, or we kill a delegate every minute until you do." Aisha looked down at the wounded ambassador, then at the terrified faces of the other council members. 5 raiders, 1 weapon, no backup in sight. The odds were impossible. Yet something in her refused to yield. Perhaps it was that primitive human stubbornness Vex-Tar had so recently mocked. "Here's my counteroffer," she called back, rising slightly above the table edge, weapon steady in her hands. "Release the delegates, and I ensure you leave this ship alive." Blood trickled down Aisha's temple as she fought. The raiders had superior weapons, but Aisha had something they didn't expect: desperation and training. 2 raiders already lay unconscious. The remaining 3 circled her cautiously now. "Your council friends abandoned you," one taunted, "yet you fight for them." Behind her, Ambassador Vex-Tar watched through pain-clouded eyes as this human, this creature he had moments ago deemed unworthy, stood as his only shield. The lead raider aimed at the wounded Xorlian. "Move or he dies." Without hesitation, Aisha positioned herself directly in the line of fire. "You'll have to go through me first." The raider fired. Aisha didn't flinch. In the split second before the energy blast reached her, Aisha twisted her body and swung the stolen rifle like a club. The blast struck the weapon instead of her chest, shattering it in a shower of sparks and molten components. The impact threw her backward, but she rolled with the force, coming up on one knee beside the ambassador. Her hands stung from the heat, red and blistered. The smell of burnt plastic and metal filled the air. She had lost her only weapon, but gained precious seconds. "Impressive reflexes," the lead raider said, adjusting his aim, "but ultimately futile." Aisha's chest heaved as she caught her breath. The cut on her temple throbbed, blood running down her cheek. The fight had been brutal so far. After her initial surprise attack, she had managed to disarm 1 raider completely, using the ceremonial staff with a skill that came from years of martial arts training on Earth. The second had fallen when she triggered a ceiling panel to collapse on him, using the ship's damaged systems to her advantage. But now she stood weaponless before the remaining 3, her body aching from blows received in the chaotic exchange. Behind her, Vex-Tar's breathing grew more labored. "This is your final warning," the lead raider said. "Step aside, or both of you die here." Aisha glanced quickly around the chamber. The other delegates were huddled in the far corner, watched by one of the raiders. Security still hadn't arrived. The raiders must have sabotaged the internal communication systems. She was truly alone. "Why do you protect him?" asked the raider on the left, genuine curiosity in his voice. "We heard his words to you. He thinks your kind are animals." Aisha didn't move from her defensive position. "What someone thinks of me doesn't determine how I treat them," she said firmly. "That's my choice." Vex-Tar made a gurgling sound behind her. She risked a quick glance back. The ambassador's eyes were fixed on her, something like wonder in their alien depths. "If you surrender now," the lead raider offered, "we might consider sparing the Xorlian. He's almost dead anyway." Aisha's mind raced. She needed to buy more time. Where was ship security? The council vessel should have internal defenses against boarding parties. "Unless you have someone inside," she said suddenly, the realization dawning. "Someone who disabled the security systems before you boarded." The slight stiffening of the lead raider's posture confirmed her suspicion. "Clever human," he said, his voice colder now. "Too clever to leave alive." His finger tightened on the trigger. Aisha braced herself, knowing she couldn't dodge this time. Suddenly, a weak voice spoke from behind her. "Stop." Ambassador Vex-Tar struggled to sit up, green blood soaking the makeshift bandages. The human speaks truth. The raiders hesitated, surprised to hear the wounded diplomat address them directly. What truth, Corleone? Demanded the leader. That life has value beyond our prejudices. Vextar gasped, each word clearly costing him great effort. I refused to sit beside her. Now she stands between death and me. Aisha remained poised to move, watching the raiders' weapons for any sign of firing. Pretty words won't save either of you, snarled the lead raider. The Krath Collective has been ignored too long. Today's attack will show the council we cannot be dismissed. And yet, Aisha said quietly, killing unarmed diplomats will only prove you're exactly what they believe you to be, savages who cannot be reasoned with. The words hung in the air. Something flickered in the leader's eyes behind his mask. Doubt. Aisha pressed her advantage. There's still time to change this outcome. Take me as your hostage instead, one human representative. Release the others as a show of good faith. Why would we agree to that? Asked the raider on the right. Because my world is new to the council, Aisha explained, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Earth has no powerful allies yet, but we have something you need. And what could your primitive planet possibly offer us? The leader scoffed. A fair hearing, Aisha said simply. Humans understand what it means to be overlooked, to fight for recognition. If your grievances are legitimate, we would hear them without the prejudice of ancient politics. For a moment, no one moved. Even the wounded Vextar seemed to hold his breath. Then the lead raider laughed, a harsh sound through his mask. Fine words, but we came for results, not promises. He raised his weapon and fired directly at Aisha's chest. In that instant, something unexpected happened. Ambassador Vextar lunged upward with strength born of desperation, pushing Aisha partially aside. The blast caught them both, striking Vextar in the shoulder and grazing Aisha's side. They fell together, the human and the Corleone, behind the minimal cover of the overturned table. Pain seared through Aisha's ribs like fire. She gasped, pressing her hand against the wound. Beside her, Vextar lay motionless, his scales now almost completely gray. Why? She whispered to him, shocked by his action. The ambassador's eyes flickered open. You showed courage, honor, things my people have forgotten. Before Aisha could respond, the chamber doors suddenly burst open. Armored security forces streamed in, weapons drawn. The raiders, caught by surprise, turned to face the new threat. Surrender immediately, commanded the security chief. In the chaos that followed, Aisha remained beside the fallen ambassador, applying pressure to both his wounds and her own. The firefight was brief but intense. 2 raiders were stunned into unconsciousness, while the third, the leader, was cornered against the chamber wall. This isn't over, he snarled as security forces surrounded him. The Krath will be heard. As medical teams rushed into the chamber, Aisha felt her strength ebbing. Blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Ambassador Vextar's hand weakly reaching for hers. Perhaps, he whispered, humans are not so primitive after all. 2 weeks later, Aisha stood before the reassembled Galactic Council, her arm in a healing sling. Ambassador Vextar approached the podium, his scales shimmering. The chamber fell silent. I denied this human a seat beside me, he began, voice carrying to every corner. I called her species primitive and unworthy. Then she risked her life to save mine. He turned to face Aisha directly. Lieutenant Chen not only saved my life, but taught me that true civilization isn't measured by technological advancement, but by compassion and courage. The Corleone gestured to the empty seat beside his own. This seat will always belong to humanity, not because they have earned it, but because they have taught us we need them beside us. As Aisha took her place, delegates from 27 worlds stood in respect, not for Earth's power, but for one human's heart. The council chamber on the repaired flagship Harmony looked almost exactly as it had before the attack. Clean, pristine, with no visible scars from the violence that had unfolded here. But the people inside had changed. Aisha adjusted her formal diplomatic uniform, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the healing energy burn along her side. The medical team had done remarkable work, technology far beyond Earth's capabilities, but some wounds needed time, not just advanced medicine. Elder Zimtal nodded to her from the head of the table. The ancient Vordian had personally visited her in the medical bay each day of her recovery. His wrinkled face broke into a smile as she straightened to attention. "The Council recognizes Lieutenant Aisha Chen of Earth," he announced formally, whose actions during the Krath incursion demonstrated exceptional courage and wisdom. Aisha felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "I only did what was necessary, Elder." "What was necessary?" came a voice from across the chamber. "And what was right?" Ambassador Vextar had entered through the main doors. His scales had regained their vibrant blue color, though he moved with care, still recovering from his own injuries. The Xorlian delegation behind him seemed surprised by their leader's words. The chamber hushed as Vextar approached the central podium. For generations, the Xorlian Confederation had been one of the most influential voices in the Council. Their technological achievements were legendary, their cultural refinement the standard by which other species measured themselves, and they had been among the most vocal opponents of Earth's admission to the Galactic Alliance. "Esteemed colleagues," Vextar began, his voice stronger than Aisha had expected. "2 weeks ago, we gathered in this chamber to discuss the Krath threat. Instead, we experienced it firsthand." He paused, his multifaceted eyes scanning the room. "And in doing so, we learned something unexpected." Aisha stood perfectly still, unsure where this was heading. "I denied this human a seat beside me," Vextar continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent chamber. "I called her species primitive and unworthy. Then she risked her life to save mine." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates. Several nodded in agreement, having witnessed Aisha's actions during the attack. "My people pride themselves on our evolutionary advancement," Vextar said, touching his chest where the energy blast had struck him. "We measure civilization by technological achievement, by the elimination of conflict, by the refinement of culture. Yet when violence came to this chamber, our advanced civilization had no answer." He turned to face Aisha directly. His eyes, once cold with disdain, now held something she'd never expected to see: respect. "Lieutenant Chen not only saved my life, but taught me that true civilization isn't measured by technological advancement, but by compassion and courage." When I asked why she would help one who had insulted her kind, she said simply, "Because that's what humans do." Kilora, the Ithian representative, glowed brighter in agreement. Elder Zimtal nodded slowly, his ancient eyes wise. "The medical team tells me that Lieutenant Chen was struck by the same blast that would have killed me," Vextar continued. "She positioned herself to shield me, knowing the risk. 3 broken ribs, second-degree burns across 20% of her body, a concussion from combat with the raiders. And still, she did not abandon her duty." Aisha swallowed hard, uncomfortable with the attention. The injuries had been painful, yes, but she had simply done what any trained officer would do. "The intelligence report on the attack has been circulated," Elder Zimtal added. 6 raiders of the Krath Collective, assisted by an insider who has since been identified and apprehended. Their goal was to capture council members to force recognition of their territorial claims. "What the report doesn't say," Vextar interjected, "is that without Lieutenant Chen's intervention, they would have succeeded. While we cowered or froze, one human stood firm." The Xorlian ambassador moved to his designated seat at the great circular table. Beside it was the empty chair, the one he had refused to allow Aisha to occupy during the previous meeting. He gestured to it with a formal sweep of his arm. "This seat will always belong to humanity, not because they have earned it through technological advancement or cultural refinement, but because they have taught us that we need them beside us. They remember what many of us have forgotten, that compassion without courage is merely sentiment, and wisdom without action is simply philosophy. A hush fell over the chamber. In the history of the Galactic Council, no species had ever offered such recognition to another, especially not one so newly arrived on the interstellar stage. Aisha walked slowly to the offered seat, conscious of every eye upon her. As she sat down beside Ambassador Vextar, something unprecedented happened. It began with Kilora, her bioluminescent form brightening as she rose from her seat. Then Elder Zimtal, struggling to his feet with the help of his aide. One by one, the delegates from 27 worlds stood in respect, not for Earth's power or technology, but for one human's heart. "I believe," said Elder Zimtal, his ancient voice cracking with emotion, "that we have much to learn from our newest members. Perhaps it is time we reconsider what makes a civilization truly advanced." As the standing ovation continued, Ambassador Vextar leaned slightly toward Aisha. "My people have a saying," he said quietly. "The strongest metals are forged in the hottest fires." Perhaps humanity's difficult path has created strengths we more advanced species have lost. Aisha smiled, thinking of Earth's long, troubled history. The conflicts and challenges that had nearly destroyed her species, but had ultimately taught them resilience. "We still have much to learn from you," she replied diplomatically. "And we from you," Vextar said, his scales shifting to a respectful violet hue. "Beginning with the most important lesson of all, that no seat at any table should remain empty because of prejudice." Around them, the council chamber hummed with new energy, the beginnings of true understanding between different worlds. An empty seat had become a powerful symbol of change.